Before we start, I first met Jassa at a book launch, actually, which is quite fitting. And he was just in the final stages of finishing this book, which is now complete. And it really does feel like it's a very personal journey, and we'll explore this through the course of the evening. And I remember going to your very first book launch in London, and it's been a real evolution, I think, for Jassa. This is a very personal book for him, as we'll explore through the course of the evening. It also lays out quite a lot of interesting theories and arguments about being both, not half. And I mean, I'm guessing and assuming that there are some of you who are both, not half. And that phrase is something that has really entered the discourse in a different way since this book came out. We'd always hear that people were mixed race, or, other sort of half but not both. It wasn't a kind of an inclusive term, and it's really interesting because I think everybody in the room knows people who are both not half. My niece and nephew are both not half, and lots of my friends are as well. And when I talk about this book, it's sort of, for them, they now feel seen because it's, a new phenomenon. There are so many more mixed relationships, in this day and age. So it's a really interesting book. I love it, and hopefully you will all get the chance to read it if you haven't already. We're going to start by getting Jassa to read the opening passage of the book, just to get us into the swing of this. So over to you, Jassa.
Here we go. All right, chapter 1, Alone in the Jungle. My first performance ever caught on camera was in India. It was late February 1994. I was 3 years old and I had stage fright. I was at my great-uncle and auntie's house in Moga, Punjab, surrounded by women I didn't know, all decked out in brightly coloured salwars, clapping along to music I wasn't familiar with. Where was the Bhangra? I had come prepared for Bhangra. I was sporting a bright red kurta complete with an embroidered black waistcoat and handkerchiefs tied to my little fingers. Apart from my blonde hair and white skin, I was the very image of a Punjabi folk dancer. As my dad operated the camcorder, my mum tried to coax me into letting loose, but I couldn't find my rhythm. After all, I'd never been to a sangeet, a pre-wedding party arranged by and for the women of the bride and groom's families, and Asha Bhosle's Jam Jam Nachdi Firan wasn't doing it for me. But the next day, my dad's cousin's wedding day, the dol player arrived and filled the gully with the sound I longed for. It didn't matter that I was now dressed in the page boy's outfit that had been made for my maternal auntie's New Forest wedding the previous spring. My gold silk shorts, short-sleeved white shirt and bow tie, made from the same embroidery used in my auntie's bodice, did nothing to hold me back. The unmetalled Punjab street was my stage. I was totally unfazed by the crowd watching me. A few uncles joined in periodically, as did my mum, who was holding my darker-skinned baby sister, Ramanique. But I was unstoppable. Bhangra was in my bones. If the door was playing, I was dancing. I only stopped when my mum, worried I was going to get heat stroke, tipped the drummer generously and persuaded him to take a break. This was my first experience of India. Music, dance, and joy. When the father of the bride, my granddad's younger brother, Uncle Jagir, saw us off at the train station, he held out his hand to shake mine. I duly obliged. But a few moments later, I was holding up my arms for a hug. He scooped me up and I wrapped myself around his neck. I felt safe here. This was home. Another home.
So that's the opening passage of Jassa's book, but there is actually a video that you can see of a baby Jassa doing that dance at that wedding, which is on your Twitter,
it's on
TikTok,
Instagram and
Instagram.
All the socials.
So do look it up because it is very sweet.
I haven't read it in a while. It sort of caught me off guard a bit at the end. I was like, it
was obviously very moving, and it also got a few laughs in the audience, but it does set us up for the journey that we take on this book. And I guess the first question I want to ask on behalf of the audience is, what prompted you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, so it sort of all came about because of the TED Talk. The TED Talk really gave me the opportunity to write the book and dig deeper into the ideas. And the TED Talk really came about just because of a silly video I did on Instagram of me speaking Punjabi, pretending to be like a Punjabi uncle, berating myself for deciding to use corn vegan pieces in my dal, and I sort of imagined like what an uncle figure might make of this, and I shot it on my phone, very sort of haphazard. I was still in my dressing gown. I've been doing like a side hustle gig working for a journalist, actually. I'd cycled home, had a shower, but the reason I did that video is because I'd sort of got to this point in my career as an actor where I was no longer content with being professionally white, and that's really like the industry as an actor. So much of casting and what you get to play, the characters and roles you go up for is so much around appearance. And there was this shift in the industry, or there was more sort of the conversations were going on at the time about trying to, tell more representative stories, diverse casting, all of this. And I found that really exciting, like Satnam's Sangera's The Boy with the Top Knot was being made for TV. And, Mira Sayal actually encouraged me, said, like, you should go and get seen for this. But there was no role for me in that. There was, you had a couple of white characters, and then you had the Punjabi family, but there was nothing really for me to be able to contribute to that story, despite the fact that The Boy with the Top Knot hugely resonates with my own family.
Is that because people didn't see you as either?
No, they just saw me as white. That was what the industry sort of taught me, and it sort of taught me to be grateful for my whiteness. I played a Soviet spy in Peaky Blinders and a Cockney telegraph boy in Ripper Street. Those opportunities, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I got those opportunities at a time when my brown peers were struggling to get a foot on the ladder. I'm very aware of that, the sort of the privilege that came with being able to, I hate the term pass, but like the fact that I was white presenting meant that I could go up for those roles. But then I felt this huge part, and the reason that's the opening of the book is my love of performance was intimately linked to my Punjabiness. As a child, it came through dance, it came through Bhangra, and here I was getting to sort of live this, really pursue my dream of being a professional performer, and yet I couldn't draw on the sort of the inspiration for that, which was my Punjabi heritage. And so I sort of looked to people like Just Rain, Guz Khan, people that had done like viral video stuff, like YouTuber stuff online, and had seen how that had really put them on the map. And I think I also found a sense of community and belonging through them as well, seeing, resonance, and, they were of my generation. Goodness Gracious Me is absolute classic, but it's like, it wasn't my generation. And that was...
It was mine. Showing my age.
But yeah, and I felt that connection, and so it was really just, I was quite inspired by them, and so yeah,
so that's why you did the TED Talk.
So yeah, I did the video. The video sort of took off, and then in the comments on that video, because the whole both not half phrased, it didn't originate in that moment. As I posted the video, I think I used the hashtag White Punjabi at the time, because I was still, it was just a way of trying to assert my identity in the world. And then as it sort of went like mad overnight, I was going through the comments the next day, and one of the comments was somebody tagging their mate in, saying, this guy speaks better Punjabi than us, and he's only half. And seeing the words only half, like so explicitly in black and white there, I was like, I'm not half. Because what I realised watching the video was that I don't just speak Punjabi, like, it's not like I've learnt Punjabi as an adult. It's like I speak it with my voice, but also like my whole body. Like there's a whole embodied Punjabiness that I brought to that, which I hadn't realized, but people who were watching it were picking up on it, and people were finding it quite confusing when they were watching it. And that's when, and seeing somebody point out the halfness in the comments made me then go like, oh no, I'm not half, am I? That's actually the whole framing of this is.
So that was the kind of early genesis then of this
Yeah,
whole thought process.
That became Both Not Half. That became the TED Talk, and then the book.
I do just want to say
to actually answer your question. Sorry.
No. Journalist, keep him on track. And how does the book come about then?
So I did the TED Talk in January 2020, that beautiful year, where nothing happened. I did the TED Talk in January 2020.
That was in India, wasn't it?
In India, in Chandigarh, which was incredible. Also, I'd prepared the talk. I'd sort of written the talk for myself earlier in the year with no intention of it being a TED Talk. I had written it as sort of hoping, I don't know, I could make it as a Guardian long read. But nobody was really interested in it. But then out of the blue, the TEDx Chandigarh team sort of dropped me a DM on Instagram and were like, would you like to do a talk? And I was like, I've got this talk, this essay is good to go. Let's do it. And then it almost all fell apart because it clashed with unforgotten filming dates. Then, big up Sanjeev Bhaskar and Nicola Walker because they really came to my rescue and were like, you have to do the talk. We'll make sure the dates work. So I went and did that, and it really caught me off guard. It was sort of, and looking back, it just seems obvious now, the sort of the India is a country of mixed heritages, and I was so at that point still quite focused on my own experience and trying to figure out who I am that I hadn't really thought about that. It was received so warmly and with such intensity that it caught me off guard a bit. And then when I got back, then obviously lockdowns, all of that, and the video. So the talk didn't come out until around August, but then once it did, our good friend Satam Sangera very kindly said, if you ever think about writing a book, let me know. I'm sort of referring some people to an agent. And I didn't know if there was something there. If I knew the ideas, that I probably wanted to explore it further. But then I had this meeting with an agent over Zoom, and I thought it was literally just going to be for some advice, because I was like, I don't really even know the difference between an agent and a publisher. I don't know how you pitch a book. I don't know how you even go about writing it. I dropped out of uni at the start of my second year. I've never really written anything over 10,000 words. It seems quite terrifying. And over the course of this meeting, what I thought was a meeting about getting advice, she started using statements including saying we would do this, and I was like, we, and that sounds like you're into it, and she was like, yeah, I think this book's got legs, if you want to go for it. And then I spent a year having a breakdown because I just didn't know how to write a book, and I didn't know what the story was, or because I'd done the TED Talk, but that was 17 minutes. I think the audiobook's 11 hours. There's a lot more in it. And what I was really struggling with is that I couldn't figure out how the story, what the story was. Was the story the journey to Both Not Half? And I was like, well, that's the story of the TED Talk. Or does the story begin with Both Not Half and the journey thereafter? And then that sort of was trying to become like a new history of the world from the perspective of the mixed experience. And I was like, I don't think I can do that. That's a bit too much to chew on. And then I threw all of that out. And then I was like, right, but I am an actor, I'm a storyteller, I'm a filmmaker. I understand this is essentially, I guess, my own personal journey of transformation, of figuring out who I am. That is a classic, timeless story arc. Forget that it's a non-fiction book. If I was telling this as a story, what's the movie version of this? How would the movie start? And the movie would start with that scene in India. And so that's how I started writing it. And then when I put that structure together, I realized that the Both Not Half realization, the articulation of that was not the beginning nor the end, it was the middle. It was the discovery of, Aladdin discovering the genie in the lamp. It's the magic thing that then starts to change everything. And so that's really how the book developed. It became the journey to articulating Both Not Half, and then how seeing the world through this lens of multiplicity and wholeness as opposed to sort of fractionality, how that sort of changed my relationship with the world and then ultimately myself. I hadn't realised the journey hadn't ended really when I started writing the book.
And I know from talking to you in the final stages of writing the book, it really was in some ways like part therapy for you, wasn't it? Kind of understanding yourself and how you fit in with your identity and the world. And having read the book, it's part memoir, part political statement, would you say? Or how would you sort of describe? I mean, it does a lot of things. It's not like a standard kind of memoir, is it? By any
No, I didn't want it to be just about my experiences, and there's a lot of that's in there. But it's also, I am just sort of politically active, and I think also both not half as a statement as it applies so broadly. It's sort of attacking. It's attacking hierarchical thinking and sort of the sort of thinking and structuring and categorizing that sort of creates structures of control. And I think that's the thing that I really started to realize, was that this went beyond just the experience of ethnicity or the mixed race experience.
And we'll come to that in a minute, of course, won't we?
It was sort of much broader, and so I think just attacking when you're sort of looking to change like ways of thinking, particularly ways of thinking that are designed, the phrase half or any sort of like fractional language when it comes to race, heritage, ethnicity is intimately linked to the history of race and scientific racism. And, that was how it was, part of the policies of like slavery and like the ways in which that thinking was all about creating control and separating, creating whiteness, white supremacy. So it's inherently political, I think, is what I'm basically trying to say, is that by challenging that, it was always going to be political. And then that's when I started to realise that it had all these knock-on effects in other areas. It sort of really started to open my eyes to the ways in which, I guess, like structures in society love to be like, you've got to be in that box, and if you're in that box, it means you can't be in that box, and if you try to be in more than one of them at the same time, that's going to cause a problem. So I sort of set out to try and cause a lot of trouble. Yeah.
One of the things you said before at one of the talks I was in the audience for was just how it was a bit of a challenge to get it published, in the sense that some publishers said, we've already got a mixed race book, we don't need any more. Yeah,
it's like such a new space within publishing. It felt very much like, I thought it was going to be, and I think my agent as well, quite an experienced agent with a decent sized agency, was like, we've got a TED Talk, a BBC documentary, we had the endorsement from Satnam quite early on, I've got, modest profile already, so that there was a great sort of cocktail of ingredients. And we only had like one offer, and thankfully it was with Bonnier, with Blink, that I was really happy, and they would have always been my top choice. But it was really disheartening, and it's all to do with like numbers, money, and what they think will sell, what won't sell. There seemed to be no sort of sense of like, well, there can be more than one voice on a topic, and I think I really struggled early on to try and convince people of like the merits of like why this particular book, and why, and actually, I've done with the Mixed Up podcast, Nicole and Emma, and their book, The Half of It, came out not long after mine, and there are others who are sort of writing and doing stuff in the same space, and we've really very actively worked to sort of come together and recognise that we are community, not competition. But because the industry sort of has sort of made us feel like we were in competition, we're all sort of panicking about like whose book's coming out when, and what topics are you covering, and all of that, because the industry sort of creates the idea that there's only one space.
And only one story to be told.
And only one story to be told. And so we very actively sort of like, we're gonna support each other. And we're gonna make sure that, we'll do events together, and we'll do that, because, and it's so narrow and short-sighted, because people don't just read one book about a subject that they're interested in. You read lots and lots of books about the things that you're into. And I think that's why I've been really keen to sort of, when I've been early on promoting the book, by supporting this book, you're not just supporting me and this story, it's like helping create the opportunities for others as well. I don't know. I've been having lots of conversations about this. I find it really disheartening how the publishing industry seems to treat books, even though they're part of like maybe a big publishing house. It does seem like, your marketing budget and all these other financial elements is just about your book. It's like, why, if you've got people who are selling like hundreds of thousands of copies of whatever, can you maybe not use some of those profits to sort of help bring other people through? Is that not how it's meant to work? But it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be, at least at the first, if it's your first book, they'll get lots of first books. Hopefully somebody breaks out, and then, maybe if you have a second book, and I don't know, I'm still sort of figuring it out.
You talk about opening up the discussion, I guess, around being both not half, not just for you, but for other writers and, of course, other people in other fields. One of the things that I wanted to, because I think the personal touches in this book really do bring to light some of the arguments that are more kind of heavyweight to light by your stories that you share. And I think there was a real contrast for me when I read the book, when there's a passage where Jassa talks about basically getting privilege from a teacher at school because he's both not half and therefore he's more white than the other Indian kids and sort of gets, different treatment. And then on the other hand, when you're at an Indian wedding and you're dancing like crazy to Bhangra and someone's kind of, I don't know how you phrased it, but, kind of pointing at you like you're a freak. And so this is two different experiences. There's the privilege that you sort of say you've got by looking white.
Yeah.
And then there's the racism that you've sometimes experienced. But it's mixed up because it's both communities, as it were, who can't quite place you.
Yeah, it's been a strange... Though I sort of draw on some of those experiences as a way to sort of highlight how... I think for a long time I was trying to find belonging out from outside. Like I was trying to look elsewhere to be like, oh, okay, maybe you can make me feel like I belong, or maybe you can make me feel like I belong. This is a big thread through the book is my relationship with my sister and the different ways her experiences being more frequently racialized as brown, as a queer woman, and me sort of like looking to her for belonging. And actually I was looking everywhere apart from at myself. And actually the journey of the book has been about trying to find that within myself, and then using that, the confidence of feeling like I belong to myself, to then go out and be like, okay, now how do we create that out in the world? And I think that's a real shift in my thinking, was from thinking like belonging was something sort of static that was to be found, and actually come to realize that it's more something that we do and that we create, and is actually much more in flux and is constantly evolving as well. I think that ultimately comes back to the idea of identity as well, and why I think some of that confusion was coming from this sense, particularly. I know we might touch on it a bit, like around like national identity, or even like with my Sikh identity or Punjabi identity, even, is that you think of it as being like fixed. There is a sort of an archetypal Sikh, Punjabi, English person, Brit, but actually these are all constantly in flux and are being created and recreated through what people bring to it at certain points in history. The example that I think I loved when I was discovering that, like aloo gobi, a very, very sort of traditionally Punjabi dish, or even like samosa, like Guru Nanak, founder of the Sikh faith, would not have eaten any of those things because potatoes and cauliflower were introduced to India through colonizing powers. But to sort of think of either as being not Punjabi would be preposterous. And it sort of just really, for me, that was like, oh yeah, it is just sort of what we make it. And I think that's why I feel quite confident now. Like, I found that within myself. I now feel very comfortable to come out and be like, I am a Sikh, and I might be a different sort of Sikh to what you might expect or what you might think of it, but this is what I'm contributing to this. The same with my Punjabiness, same with my Englishness, and I think that's why it sort of became this much more all-encompassing sort of manifesto, is to be like, we do get to decide who we are. We can be the authorities on our identities.
Can you make aloo gobi?
Can I make
aloo
yeah?
gobi?
Can I make aloo gobi? Yeah.
I can't
do samosa though. I need to work on my aloo paronte.
Has anyone got any questions at this stage?
I'm Cheryl. So when I was growing up in London, there was a phrase of the coconut. So I'm brown on the outside but white on the inside. And my sister is blonde, with green eyes, and she's older than me, and she constantly defended me through my childhood at school, being the packy kid, the this kid, the that kid. And oh, but you're a punk. You can't be a punk, you're a packy, da-da-da-da-da, all this sort of stuff. But I was going to say, did you find yourself defending your sister when you were growing up? Being the white kid and her being the brown kid?
What's interesting about is that well, to my shame, really, I wasn't even aware of some of the extent of some of the racist abuse that my sister experienced at school. I was like her older, geeky, uncool brother, so as much and also she was very capable of taking care of herself. If anything, she would be coming to my defense in most situations. But so I didn't really have the opportunity to do that. But that was also largely because we were both growing up in such a diverse city in Leicester. But for both of our experiences, I mean, I can't really speak on her behalf, but like, we grew up in a city where, part of the city is shut down for Diwali. Like, I that for me was just normal. When I was at primary school, when we were both at primary school, my turban-wearing grandfather was, teaching at that school. So my sort of identity was known and understood by the staff and most of the other kids at the school. And this was like the bizarre thing of like having this feeling of not quite knowing where I fit in came quite late in my life. And again, to sort of really speak to what I was saying about, it wasn't really my sister who ever had the problem in that way or needed defending, was because when I first had my first experience of feeling, when I was at the wedding where I was dancing, and it was a young girl who was like looking at me. I talk about it in the TED Talk. And I could just tell from the way that she was looking at me that she couldn't quite make sense of where to place me, or like, why is he's doing it, but he doesn't look. And she just looked really, really confused. And I was explaining this to my sister, and my sister goes like, oh, that's probably your first experience of being othered, isn't it? And so, and it was really quite, yeah.
She's like, finally.
Yeah. And it was heartbreaking, because I sort of realised in that moment what had been like for me this like big turning point event for me at age 24, I think, had been her every day for so long. Yeah, there are lots of examples where I wish I'd had the chance to have sort of stepped up for her in that way, but I was largely ignorant, and I'm quite candid about that. I think there was a version of this book that I tried to write where I wanted to make it sound like I'd had it all figured out and I had all the answers, but I realised that, and thankfully, and the response has been quite wonderful from people who have maybe come to the book maybe with a certain set of ideas and have had their minds changed or been challenged to think differently, as I think largely come from the fact that I was honest about mistakes and where I didn't get things right, and I felt quite guilty about that for a while as well, particularly around stuff around race and identity. And this goes back to the thing about publishing, is because it felt like in order to tell a story like this, you sort of had to have that early experience, which I know a lot of people do have, of like, when I first started school, or I was like 3 years old when I first realised that I was different. But what I've tried to do with this is point out, while that is true for many, it was also true for me that I had a joyous upbringing. It was wonderful, and I was able to be fully both. And that may largely be because I look white, and so I was afforded sort of grace and privileges in a way that my brown peers weren't. But wouldn't it be wonderful if all kids, or all of us, could experience that sort of joy? And I think the reason I speak Punjabi as well as I do is because there was no expectation on me to speak Punjabi, and therefore I was able to make mistakes and just sort of stumble my way through. And my engagement with the language and the culture was always...
Which doesn't happen with a lot of South Asian kids.
No.
I'm sure there's many of you here who also got judged whenever we went on holiday to India for our English accents and our bad grammar. And we're like, we're just trying. I mean, I think a lot of the things that Jassa writes about in the book could apply to people who are not of mixed heritage, because it's that moment where, we realise we look like everyone else, or... things are different. And so it is, we're going to explore this in a bit of detail and look at identity in a second, but I'm just aware that there is another question that's waiting in the wings.
I was transracially adopted into a white family, and I was very successful. They were lovely parents. I went and found my birth father, who's Punjabi Sikh, in Canada.
Can I ask you, what age did you meet your father?
I was 28. But I had that cultural dissonance, and I wondered... Can you remember moments where you felt you had to take sides?
Yeah, I felt very strongly like I had to pick a side very recently in the wake of the race riots. I remember I didn't realise how strongly I felt the threat of racial violence personally. I think, again, because I sort of felt like, well, I look white and therefore it doesn't really apply to me. But that was that very sort of external thinking. I hadn't thought about the fact that I've grown up with stories of racial violence. I've grown up with my grandfather always had a hockey stick in the back of his car just in case. Of my dad going to the park as a kid carrying a cricket bat, regardless of whether there was a game on that day, just to make sure, you got something on you. Of my dad being told during like the 80s by my grandfather. If you get attacked, make sure you take at least one of them with you. Like, so, and that was all. I haven't done an event in a while, and so it still becomes.
Okay.
And then Riz Ahmed's short film, The Long Goodbye, came out, and I remember watching that and just feeling it so viscerally, and I didn't know how to make sense of that, because also, I mean, that story is very much about, you know, it was, I don't know if everyone's seen it, but it's like it's a short film sort of about a British Muslim family preparing for a wedding and then sort of being attacked by sort of St George's Cross wearing paramilitaries. And I guess also I've grown up with a history of partition and the sort of the violence and sort of the, you know, I've got an auntie who married a Muslim, and I saw sort of all the friction and all the history that brought up. And so, but I realised when watching that film, like there was just so much of that was latent within me. And I remember in response to that, I wrote a spoken word piece as a way to sort of process it. And in that, I did say, you know, if I have to pick a side, I'll give my mixed blood with pride. And that came from that feeling that I think there are situations in which you can and have to pick a side, where I don't think it is problematic. I think, but I don't think that's not me picking my Indianness or my Punjabiness over my Britishness or anything, because actually, you know, it's just a case of values and, you know, what you hold dear. But like, obviously, that's it within a very sort of a situation of like racist opposition. Beyond that, that's been the most sort of tangible feeling. And so, like, when stuff happened, I was very quick to make sure that I was available and free to go along to the Walthamstow anti-racist rally. But beyond that, I think I haven't felt like I've had to. And I think I was very lucky, again, just to talk about growing up in Leicester. I was just able to move so fluidly between bonfire night and Diwali. It was just like an excuse for double fireworks. It was really, really joyous. And again, like, I think what I found interesting, and I think what I've really loved hearing from readers who've read the book, is that I think we're often presented with the fact that it can only ever be a struggle, and that there's always this sense of choice. And I don't deny that is very true for lots of people, but once I realised that it wasn't a problem, that wasn't my experience, that sort of set me free a bit. And then I think it was also quite, again, joyous to be able to be like, it is possible. It doesn't always have to be this struggle. Here's an example. Like, I don't think my parents knew quite what they were doing. It was just obvious to them to raise me in this way. And I think because of my whiteness, that sort of like added this element to it that they couldn't quite control. But I think, yeah, all I've tried to do is just present and be like, here, it is entirely possible to exist as parts of multiple places and cultures without feeling this need to choose a part of yourself, because there is no part, there is only a whole.
Thank you, Jessa, and thank you for being so, like, it's a very personal book, so that's why this, you know, I think, and I think for a lot of us, I mean, I think I mentioned this a second ago, but there'll be many of us who were born and raised in the UK with Indian parentage or wherever else, you know, that's not English, but also, we also had to make some of those choices, and we sometimes wouldn't want to say that we know, I remember my mum going out once and wearing a sari, and the neighbour who saw us all the time had never seen her in a sari, and I remember the look he gave her, and feeling embarrassed that my mum was in a sari, when actually now I love every opportunity I can to wear a sari. You know, a lot of us have gone through that feeling of almost being ashamed of our Indianness at a time when, you know, we grew up with bricks through our front door or being called the P word, and now everyone wants to kind of have chicken tikka and wear a bindi. You know, I mean, it's the world's changing, but it's not just people who are both, not half. It's all kinds of backgrounds that people have been able to relate to. And you mentioned Goodness Gracious Me. I remember going to see that, I'm much older than Jassa, years ago, and half of the audience was white. You know, there's so much relatability in a lot of these themes. You don't have to be of colour. You don't have to be, you know, mixed cultures.
My mate's Polish mum is reading it at the moment, and she's loving it.
Yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah.
just a lot of relatability. And in a minute, actually, we've got 2 more questions that I'm going to get to. And then I want Jassa to read another passage because it kind of speaks to a lot of what we've just talked about.
What was the greatest gift you received in the process of writing this book? The other question I have is, what are you most excited about looking into the future?
I think the greatest gift was the way in which it brought me and my sister closer together. I think there were things. I mean, we're both performers, we're both writers. Being raised in an extended immigrant family, there's always been a thing of, you know, competition and like who's doing better and all of that. And I think some of that had sadly bled into our. I mean, we've always been very close, but there were sort of points of friction that we just couldn't understand. How could we be so close, but also then often find ourselves in such painful conflict? And I think that largely came from what I touched on earlier, was me not really realising that, you know, she is a young, queer, brown woman who lives in a part of London where the rainbow pride flags outside her local pub have been defaced, I think 3 or 4 times now. She's had to fight to be who she is from a very early age in a way that I never really appreciated. And I think the realization I came to through this process was that I unconsciously was sort of reaching for her power and wanting her to share that with me, rather than me finding that for myself. And I think in the process of writing this book, I did manage to find that for myself, and as a result, being able to be myself and therefore sort of relieve that pressure and that tension in our sibling relationship, where now we can just be siblings. And that has been probably, you know, if this talk wasn't happening, if the book had sort of been a massive flop and nothing had really come of it, that would be just like the greatest thing in the world. The end of the book is sort of very much directly addressed to her. And I remember I wrote that, and I remember when I read it to her for the first time, it was like from that moment onwards, our relationship was just totally different and just much more beautiful.
And I should say, actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but Romani, your sister got married at the same spot where the flag had been defaced.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
was beautiful to see the photos, and it was a few couples that got married there at the same time.
No, they were the friends,
They were
guests
friends.
at the wedding. So my sister's partner's non-binary, and they had 2 lesbian couples who were with them. And after doing the wedding ceremony at the town hall, went into Forest Gate, and then they basically the police had, I think, put like cordons around it, but they cleared the cordons out for the photo, and then they all stood on it.
It was beautiful to see. It's
Yeah,
kind of, you know,
all of them
a
kissing, stood on it.
visualisation
Yeah, it was
of,
like a really beautiful moment of protest.
what wins over, love wins.
Very quickly, the thing I'm most excited for, because I was often trying to find these answers through my work as an actor. And it was basically stunting my ability to really perform to my fullest. And I feel now that when I'm auditioning and when I'm in rooms reading, that's now gone. And I feel so much more excited for what the future potentially has to offer me as an actor. So I'm curious to see. You know, I have no control over really as an actor. It's so much is just in the hands of other people. But that's what I'm at the moment just very excited to see what I might be able to do now that I've put that part of myself to bed.
I have 2 children who are mixed race, and before I had kids, I had this massive panic attack that I was in a relationship with a white person, and that would change my personal cultural experience. And so immediately I went into mode of what could our family life look like to reflect both, not half. And then we had kids, and I think we put a lot of effort into everything being a blend. Additionally, neither of us are from the UK, neither me nor my partner, so they're third culture kids on top of that. So in essence, they have picked sides. One's gone one direction and one's gone the other direction. None of them have chosen to go in the British direction. You've come to this relatively late in your life, as you describe it. And I just wonder with all the external forces, the weight of white supremacy, the racism that we live with, how do you maintain this sense of both, not half?
I think the second half of the book is very much about how we fight back and how we do, because it is, it's very, very difficult to exist as both, not half. Yeah, the world's not really set up for it. And I think what I've come to understand and realise is that this conversation can't just be kept to one sphere. It's not just about ethnicity. It's not just about race. It's about, fundamentally about class and social inequality at its root. And so I got involved with my union equity, thinking that I could only have a voice politically by using my identity, because I sort of grew up during the 90s at a time where sort of working class trade union activism had really been crushed and silenced. And so I felt like I needed to use identity was how you had a voice. And then I got elected to the Race Equality Committee with my union, started sort of campaigning on issues of mixed heritage casting, had some success, but through that process realised that actually this is everything that we're sort of talking about that sort of gets classed as identity politics is fundamentally, they're all sort of expressions of class inequality. And so that's, I think, it's why I've sort of become so much more involved as a trade unionist, is because I recognise that you can only create a world in which there is true mixed belonging once you eliminate, well, you've got to sort of fight against racism. That's sort of fundamental, and you can only sort of get rid of the racism if you sort of get rid of the underlying sort of social inequality. It's like you can't tackle race without tackling class. And so I guess that's where I've begun to derive a sense of hope, was that, well, if I can be more involved politically with that in mind, rather than thinking, actually you don't just necessarily want, a diversity panel every couple of months. You need to sort of fundamentally change the system that is creating the need for people to be constantly reminded that, that we've got an issue with representation and diversity. That's where I've come to find a sense of we could change things.
And can I just ask you in a much more basic level, because, obviously you're talking about it on a much bigger scale with your activism, but on a very basic level, when you grew up, because I think this is part of your question, it's like my niece, she goes to Bollywood classes, and I feel happy that she does, she can sing the Indian national anthem, it's great. My sister's not as Indian as me, because I lived in India for a while. My brother-in-law's probably more Indian, he's white, and he speaks few Tamil words here and there, but I see the kind of challenge in, it's like, well, how much do we teach them about the other culture when you live in the UK, even though we're not both not half? So I guess on a more but basic level, away from the activism, which is obviously important, how did you sort of balance it in your head when you were growing up? Did you think, I feel like I'm doing too much Punjabi stuff, or I'm doing, were there times when you wrestled with it in yourself?
So I've done a few events where my mum's also been in the audience, and then it invariably becomes a Q&A session with my mum. And similarly, it's just funny. It's reminded me, because I was sort of like stumbling around for an answer then as well, and she was like, "Should I answer?" And I was like, "Yeah, you go for it." And I was like, "Yeah, it's probably better. You did the work." And what she said, she was like, "You know what?" She sort of recognised quite early on that she was never going to be able to sort of dictate who we would become. As you say, you don't really have control. But all she could control was, with my dad and through my grandparents, was just the culture being available and accessible, and not being scared when we sort of drifted away from it, and not putting any pressure on. I think one of the stories which I sadly only remembered after the book had been published was my grandmother, my Biji, my Punjabi grandmother. We used to go to these like meditation groups, or they would take us along to these like Sikh meditation nights that I would find very, very boring. It was literally just, as a kid, I'm just like, everybody's got together and I was sat doing literally nothing in actual silence for like an hour.
That's what meditation is.
Yeah. I hadn't quite had my spiritual awakening at that point. So I was just like saying, I was like, oh my God. But I knew that if I got to the end of it, then we would have like really good food. And sometimes I would be asked to do a little like recital on my tabla, because I learnt tabla growing up because I was really, really enchanted by it. And but once, I think one Christmas, my sister had got like a little mini keyboard for Christmas, and I'd spent a lot of time like learning how to play a few little tunes on it. And so one of these sort of nights came along, and I said to BG, I was like, I want to take the keyboard, and my granddad was like, no, that's not appropriate. That's the wrong instrument. It's like it's a Sikh thing. Like you need the tabla, and BG was just like, no. If he wants to take the keyboard, he can take the keyboard. Like, and my keyboard phase lasted probably a couple of weeks.
What did you play?
I don't know. I think like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. That was like very, very basic stuff. But it was just that, like, she was just like, she was interested in what made me happy. And I think that's also what my mum was great at doing and my dad was great at doing, is just being like, whatever, if it's bringing you joy, great. If it's not, then cool. But it'll always just be there and be available. And I think that's the thing, just realizing as well, especially with like young kids, is like young kids are always trying on identities, shaking off identities. Oh, I'm going to be this and I'm going to be that. And all of that. So I think, just the not being afraid that, the trying on and shedding of identities is a natural part of just growing and developing anyway. I think at all stages of our lives. But then, then I do think, sadly, that the hard work that's required to sort of fundamentally change the social structures that allow that to be everyone's experience all the time.
That's where the activism comes in.
That's where that comes in, and why it's linked to issues of like, it's the reason why I align the Both Not Half struggle with issues of like, trans liberation and, with all sorts of other struggles. They are all aligned. They're fundamentally struggles that are looking to break down the sort of the binary ways in which we structure and order and ultimately control. And they are aligned. The world in which there is mixed belonging is a world in which there is trans belonging, a world in which there is, non-binary belonging. That those are all the same world, and that is why those fights have to be aligned. That's why I see those fights now very much as my fights. They're not just something that I'm just like, I sort of support that. It's like I tangibly feel that. It's like that is also my struggle.
I'm looking at the clock, and we did say we were going to get another passage from Jassa. It is all about identity, something we've explored quite a lot.
So the final line of the previous chapter is, Both Not Half hadn't simply changed my relationship with my mixed heritage identity. It was fundamentally changing how I saw the world. And then we get into the second half of the book, so chapter 5 onwards, which is how these ideas then start to come together. My national identity crisis began in earnest in January 2016. Please could you send a 100-word biography? I was in the midst of rehearsals for a play when I received this email from the production team. My profile was destined to feature in the program, but I had a problem. I no longer knew how to describe myself. Was I English, British Asian? For most of my life, I'd not actually given much thought to my national identity. It was only now, as a young adult, awakened to the conflicts of my mixed identity and confronted with having to biographize myself, that I began to give it serious thought. But did it even matter? Perhaps I was worrying over nothing. Perhaps I could simply omit my nationality. I looked up a few Wikipedia entries to see what the form was. Sir Ian Murray McKellen is an English stage and film actor. Dame Judith Olivia Dench is a British actress. Gurinder Chadha is a British film director of Indian origin. I expanded to sports. David Robert Joseph Beckham is an English former professional footballer. Sachin Ramesh Tendulkar is an Indian former international cricketer. Then music. Robin Rihanna Fenty is a Barbadian singer. We are defined by our work, and nationality is our go-to adjective. It was a standard, a part of reality, it seemed, that I didn't feel I could deviate from.
Thank you very much. You. Another round of applause. We talked a bit about identity already with some of the questions that we've had so far. Not too long ago, I interviewed Jassa for work on the BBC, and it was about the row in America around Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's comments that she's only suddenly announced that she's half black, which obviously is not true. She defines herself as American, but had a South Asian mother, South Indian, in fact, from the same stretch of beach as my granddad, as it happens. And also she's half Jamaican. Her father, Donald Harris, is Jamaican. We talked on that interview. I want to ask you the same question. I mean, what kind of issues did that conversation raise for you? I mean, we've already had a US president who is both not half, Barack Obama, and the whole birther theories that came around that. Now you've got a vice president who's running for the highest office, also embroiled in this. So I want to sort of explore some of the politics around mixed identity.
Yeah, I think it really comes back to that. That's what I said at the end there. Like it was a part of reality. It seemed something I couldn't deviate from. Sort of feeling like there are these fixed ways of seeing the world, and that they are somehow real, and not entirely made up through consensus. And I think the thing that I found so sort of disturbing about Donald Trump's comments was, I think we're used to him saying stupid racist stuff. I think what really jumped out to me was that it was reaching for racial purity as a means of undermining his opponent, even though it wasn't using white racial purity, but it was using just racial purity, full stop. I'd always felt like when it came to the history of race, I'd always felt like the mixed story was always sort of a footnote on the fringe. I remember reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and there's a brief line where Scout asks Jem about there are some mixed kids, and Jem says they're real sad, they don't belong anywhere. And then they just sort of move on with the rest of the story. And I remember reading that at school and just being like, I want to know more about who are those kids who don't belong anywhere, who's that about? And that was the thing that I think that particularly was with Kamala Harris, so owning her mixedness, her bothness, it really disrupts. And that's the, we're talking about how it's changing things. To have somebody in such high office disrupting ideas of race is quite helpful, and it was quite challenging. And I think that's what populists like Trump. It really undermines the way in which they make their appeals, because it is all to do with its strategies of divide and rule, and that's where the mixed population sort of create a problem. And to bring it back to what I was saying about the history, is that when I was doing my research for the book, I sort of realised that actually, I think Sita Balani has this great phrase, is that the mixed heritage person is where the work of upholding racial hierarchies becomes visible. And I think that was a really great example of racial hierarchies becoming visible, was Trump trying to be which one are you? Because I don't know how to tear you apart in the way that I normally do if you're going to somehow be like a little quantum particle. You're there and you're there and you're there and you're there. And I don't know how to pin you down. So in a way it was disturbing to see sort of racial purity being used as part of a 2024 presidential debate, but also quite heartening to see how effective it could be at sort of being disruptive.
And one thing that really struck me when we had that conversation on air was the stat that you threw out about the number of people, certainly in the US, that are of mixed heritage, according to the last census. It's a huge number now, isn't it?
I think it's huge. It's in terms of people identifying as more than one, I think it was 30% or something. It was quite a big 1 in 3. I think that sticks in my mind. I think is it by 2150, it's the UK is projected to be 75% mixed in some way.
Numbers aside, specifics, it just sort of goes to underpin how relevant this conversation is today. Because like I say, my niece, my nephew, your kids, so many other people in this room, this is a kind of, and it's not just, mixed Indian, mixed Jamaican, like Kamala Harris is. There's all kinds, because the world is becoming more global. People are falling in love with, people from all different backgrounds. And,
what I found wonderful, sorry to jump in, is that I did my mum's book club recently. She's in a very sort of predominantly white village just outside of Stratford-upon-Avon, and was chatting to all of her friends there. And there were so many of them who read this because it was just supporting my mum, supporting me. But so many of them had stories of how it had resonated with them in ways that they just hadn't expected. And that was why I fought very hard my publishers were quite keen early on to have the term mixed race on the cover, because it's that's how we, you know, it's literally a book about like not having categories and boxes, and then they're like, but we got to put it in that one. But I was like, it's mixed heritage, is because we all have some kind of mixed heritage. We come from, there is multiplicity to all of us. You know, I've made the point I made in my TED talk was that, you know, none of us are half, all of us are
We were just
both.
talking about this before we came on, because I've only in the last sort of 5 years discovered that I'm a quarter Sri Lankan. And I really am proud of that now. Although my cousin a few weeks ago said, no, we're not, because Grandma wasn't really from Sri Lanka. She was from India. And I said, no, she was born in Sri Lanka till she was 16. So it's funny how people have these arguments as well, which is a lot of what your book's about and what this conversation is about. People trying to deny.
And who gets to decide and who gets to be,
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. There was this thing that Theresa May said to diss us Remainers, that if you think you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And maybe do you think that's where we're going to try to break down these identities?
It's funny you say about the Theresa May's comment. I think I quote that at the end of chapter 5 quite specifically. I'm just seeing if I can find it. Yeah, I said in 2016, then Prime Minister Theresa May told the Conservative Party conference, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Despite the journey I've been on, I still believe this to be an entirely ridiculous, divisive statement. And I say that because the journey I've been on is really to... I sort of thought I was going to be like, we're all citizens of the world, that's all we need. But actually I've sort of... Again, it comes back to this idea of like, we have to sort of change the systems that we live within, and that I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can just throw out national identity in its entirety, because I think it is, you sort of need something to a sort of community identity that you can help shape how we live. And now I know there are arguments to be like, some people are like, well, we don't need national identity. We could, it could just be, maybe Brighton's have got a really strong identity. Bits of London have very sort of specific identities, and that what I sort of came through my research and writing was to feel that you need to have some sort of identity at the level at which our lives are controlled. And I think you can have that in some ways at a city level or a regional level and all of that. But fundamentally, at the moment, we don't have real devolution of powers in the country, in a really meaningful sense. And so I think that the case I make in the book is that national identity is sort of the emotive technology required that we have to sort of work within and change. And so I'm very... I openly embrace my Englishness and my Britishness and sort of make the case for being like almost like patriotic citizens of the world, is that recognizing that we do live in a world in which we have all these sort of transnational ties and bonds, but actually we live in nation states. And if we want to sort of influence and change those nation states and how we're governed and the ways in which we're governed, there necessarily has to be an engagement with what it means to be British or English, because those are the sort of the communities that we live in, and that
and that can sometimes be problematic. In some countries, people of certain faiths can't be identified as that nationality if they're a minority, for example. I'm not going to name particular countries, but there are many countries in the world where if you say, for example, you're Muslim or Hindu, and you're not seen as part of that national identity if you're a minority. I mean, and also like so I make the case like about for the need for really strengthening and rolling back and fighting against like the powers of citizenship stripping, because if you don't have a nation within which there is a sort of a strong sense of civic identity is never going to be like emotive enough to sort of like get people excited to sort of change the country. But if you don't have a strong civic foundation to build from, then currently in this country right now, my citizenship is less valuable than my mum's, because technically the Home Office Home Secretary could strip me of my citizenship if they so wished, without even informing me, in a way that my mum's citizenship couldn't be, because I could technically would have a claim to Indian citizenship. And so we sort of live in this situation now where our fundamental civic identity has been eroded and cracked. And I think that's where, for me, the fight sort of has to start and build up. And we have to use some of these things in order to change it. It's interesting because you can call yourself English in a way that I can't.
Yeah. And I think
go, no, but where are you really from?
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
really,
yeah.
Where are you from?
And I think I do that as a means to sort of like, I'm aware that I am in a privileged position, and so if I can be like that small bit of the wedge that can help start to drive that conversation and be like, I'm claiming my Englishness and my Punjabiness is part of that. In the same way that I was going to mention here of, not being able to speak a language, like parents like not passing on the language because of assimilation and the desire to assimilate. I think that's often seen as like a loss of culture, or somehow you're not as part of that culture or part of that entity. And I've
always been angry with my parents for not raising me to speak Tamil, because they were like yours and they wanted us to know English and be the top of the class. And I remember once being led to an English as second language class, and I was like, my English is perfect, I don't speak anything else, why am I I had to sit through the whole class. And it was mortifying for me. I must be like 6 years old or 7, and I just didn't want to be there because I didn't. But that was the racism that existed, sort of late 80s, whatever, 90s. But it was also just how everyone's just put in a box, aren't they?
But I've been trying to challenge people to say, like, in those conversations, be like, the loss of that language because of parents not wanting to pass it on, because of that. That's part of the history. That is actually part of our identities, and it can very much be a part of what it means to be somebody of Punjabi heritage or South Asian heritage or any heritage, that perhaps you don't have access to that language, and that is a result of the history of racism, and that history, that is part of it. It's not somehow a loss, it's just part of the story.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I have a Punjabi mum and a white dad. When my parents got together, it caused quite a stir, especially considering my mum's family, the rest of them had all had arranged marriages. Forgive me if it's personal, but I was wondering how your parents' relationship, how you saw that as an interracial relationship, and how that affected your attitude towards relationships and friendships.
I don't think I ever really saw it as an interracial relationship, I remember like convincing somebody on a train when I was with my dad that I was like, oh yeah, I'm actually adopted. I just thought it was hilarious. I was just a kid. The idea that I could convince a stranger that I was adopted just seemed fun. Like, I didn't really sort of...
But don't you write about it on a serious note? Don't you write about how someone said that you weren't your mum's kid, or the other way around, in the early part of the book?
Oh, there was a bit where like I sort of turned up at a wedding, and like there's the photographer sort of moves me out of the photo because he doesn't realise that I'm like with my dad.
I remember my sister also going around with my nephew once, and someone said that's not your kid because he was like a very blonde 2-year-old at the time. My
mum had a very similar experience, despite being a white woman. Was that she was out with my dad going to a wedding in London, and she was dressed up in a salwar, and they were walking back to their car, and a car sort of screamed by, and a group of lads like shouted something, and my dad just grabbed her hand and said, "Run." And what he'd heard and what my mum hadn't heard was the guys shout out, "Paki lover." And that was like this horrible, weird thing of like this sort of racist threat being made because of my dad, but directed at my white mum. I think this has been this strange experience because I grew up with these stories. So in a way I was, I guess, aware of it, but I don't think it was very at the forefront of my consciousness. Also, something that maybe I haven't made clear is that when my parents moved to Leicester from Coventry, I was sort of between the houses. But when my parents moved to Leicester, my parents' house was next door to my Punjabi grandparents. So again, it was just this extended environment. Really, probably one of the big discoveries of writing the book as well, just realising how much of my life and upbringing was just that of a British South Asian. I sort of thought I was writing a book about being mixed, but actually so many people have been like, that was my experience too. And I was like, oh yeah, it's largely because I was just raised by my Punjabi grandparents for a large part of my life. Oh, I mean, yeah, there was also another example, again, before I was born, of somebody refusing to shake my dad's hand at one of my mum's friends' wedding, just like out and out dumb racism. But again, yeah, I just had this like really joyous time growing up. And then, but what I realised was that I then, when it came to and I don't really dig into it in the book because I didn't think it didn't sort of fit with what I was going with, but I sort of realised that I didn't quite know how I felt when it came to dating. Like, I was like, because my Punjabi grandmother was very direct about it. It was like, so do you want to marry a white girl or a Punjabi girl? Because like she was just like, let's get to it. I'm like, I don't know, and it was weird like having to like think about that and like be like, is that something that is important to me? Is it important? Is it? And yeah, and I think there were sort of cultural elements mixed up in that too for a long time. You know, I'd been sort of like conditioned through family to be like, you don't look or think about like brown girls in that way. And so I remember like the first time being like attracted to a girl of South Asian heritage and just being like very confused. I'm like, what is this? But anyway, dealt with that. It's fine.
I'm Punjabi, Sikh culturally. Just in terms of identity, I thought it was quite interesting when you were talking about Englishness. You know, I've never really identified as English. It's just interesting how it's evolved, but that's something that I've actually argued with people about. You were talking about intersections of race and class and stuff like that, and I was thinking about your sister and your mum, and also myself, but that intersection of gender in that. Like for me, in 2000, I got married to an Englishman. I was the first girl in my community to do that, and it was a big deal. And I'm just wondering, like, were there differences for your sister in terms of how you were brought up at all? Because I saw men who were Sikh Punjabis going out with English people, but it was not allowed for us as girls to do that. So I'm just interested in the kind of patriarchy aspect of it all.
Yeah, I think that, again, a big part of the freedom and grace I was given as a kid was, again, because I was the older boy, I was also like the eldest boy of my whole generation of cousins as well. So that was a big part of not only the encouragement and praise and all that sort of that I was given, but also then the freedom to sort of make it my own as well. And that wasn't really afforded to my sister in quite the same way. And she did have a period of time where she sort of really rejected the culture as a result. You know what's been wonderful, actually, and again, this comes back to the sharing of joy. My Dadiji and Biji, she really truly lived the idea that people are people and love is love, and she was just so open. Like, I think for my sister, it was a big deal, like that coming out, but she was so welcomed, and so it was not an issue. And I think she's been quite, I don't really go into that because I feel like that's her story. When we've spoken about that and we've talked about it, it's been about celebrating the fact that, again, like in the way that I present this example of my upbringing, that it doesn't have to be a struggle. The assumption is it's going to be hard. But if you provide examples of like how it can just be like effortless and easy, well, maybe not easy, but like it's entirely possible and can be joyous. I think that's the thing that she's really tried to do. You know, she met her partner, now spouse, through, I don't know if you probably know Jassa Ahluwalia, who wrote Burning My Roti and runs Burnt Roti magazine. She basically was like the Rishta auntie who like introduced them. And yeah, my sister wore like a lenga for her wedding. So like she's made her Punjabiness part of her queerness. There is it's all become its own thing. Again, it's like her finding her way of like being that authority and finding a way to make those things exist.